Hello everybody, I'm Claire and welcome to my video blog. Now today I've got rather a complicated thing I want to talk about. It's about the 7/7 bombings. I'm sure everybody will be familiar with what I mean here. The bombings that took place in the London Tube on the 7th of July 2005. The official story was that 4 young men went to London, 3 of them from Leeds, and I believe they picked up one on the way, and they got to London and blew up these various trains and bus, I think there was. Now, there are quite a few problems with the official story, not least of which that quite a few details got changed in the process of the day, but I shan't be going into all those details, but trying to have an overview of what this was about, because there's been quite a lot of work done on this by the alternative community, and I'm going to be particularly talking about Nick Colostrom and his work on the book Terror on the Tube. Now, Nick is an extremely controversial chap, and I shan't be getting into some of his other more recent material, interesting though it might be. However, he's a very interesting chap who is an extremely well qualified forensic scientist, and he had some very highly positioned position as I think it was a tenure of some seat in the philosophy of science and forensic science. Extremely well qualified chap. He looked at the data on the 7/7 bombings, and I've read his book Terror on the Tube, and his data is absolutely vital to understand this, although I disagree with some of his conclusions about the interpretation of the bombers' motives, and I'll come to that. But the first thing we need to know about the bombings, which claimed 52 people, and there do seem to have been some sort of bombing, and it might have been misreported or incorrectly reported or re-reported, but there were definitely some bombs went off on public transport and some people were killed. However, it was not quite as the media reported, because there are numerous contradictions and inconsistencies. Now, the bombers were supposed to have got on the train and with their improvised bombs, which in themselves were a joke apparently, but with their improvised bombs they were supposed to have blown up the train. And I saw one of the pictures of the floor of one of these coaches that was supposed to have been bombed by the by the young chaps with their rucksacks full of chapati bombs, and one of the most obvious pictures was of the floor being blown up like that. And as Nick Colostrom pointed out, who is a forensic scientist, this is impossible for somebody who is holding a bomb on their back. If anything, the bomb would, the floor would be down like that, although he says that he doubts whether the strength of the type of improvised bomb they had would have been enough to have done any serious damage. Right, so also obviously a bomb which was placed underneath, which blew up the floor. That's the point I'm trying to make. The floor was blown up, so the bomb must have been laid under the floor, which would have also meant that it would do more damage to the derailing and the safety of the whole thing. Whereas a bomb inside the carriage may or may not damage the traction gear underneath. So that's one thing which definitely indicates that there's something funny going on here. Then there's a second one, which is that a former Metropolitan Police person by the name of Peter Power was on the news that morning, and he admitted he was at the time or has since been consultant for a Visor consultancy security group, and he admitted on air that exercises were taking place on the 3 tube stations where the actual bombs went off. Now this is rather funny, isn't it? We know that in 9/11, which has also got some pretty funny business going on around it, not being quite the same as the official story, the details don't match up. And he said at the time, there's been quite a lot of speculation about this in the alternative community, obviously, as to whether he was involved in this, whether he was a stooge, a patsy, whatever. I think he was taken off guard, because obviously there has to be some connection. 3 tube stations, you know, security operation, 3 tube stations, these were actual bombs gone. At the very least, there's been some kind of infiltration of their security business. Now, so we have a situation where it looks like there's some kind of setup or false flag. Now, where I disagree with Nick Colostrom, because I really feel his information, the detail of the material he brought out demonstrates quite clearly that the official story is not correct, and even that the young men might not have arrived in London until the first bomb had already gone off, which would obviously invalidate the official story because they couldn't have done it. So what the thing is now, Nick Colostrom, he pursued a line of inquiry which might have seemed persuasive at the time, but I believed him. In fact, I believed him, you know, at the time, and I talked to people about it. And the thing is that he was suggesting that it was purely a setup by the security forces to get these young men to take the fall. So he constructed a scenario whereby he said that these young men were actively assisting the security agencies in acting as actors, and playing the part of actors, filling in as dummy terrorists to show goodwill and cooperation. Perhaps the security agencies had kind of infiltrated some kind of Muslim community cell or something, and at the same time other people had contacted them back and said, we're concerned about this Muslim terrorism and we want to stop it within our own community. So these 4 young daring men took the opportunity to work with the security services, and yet when they got there to London, holy shit, they've been betrayed, and we're not quite sure what happened to them, possibly shot at Canary Wharf. However, over long consideration, I think that while Nick Colostrom's forensic data is absolutely convincing, quite clearly there was something going on here which was a lot more than just 4 wannabe jihadis with chapati bombs. But I would suggest that his interpretation of human motive suffers from what I did actually at the time as well, which is the pathological altruism of saying, well, this didn't happen the way that we're told. The young men possibly didn't even get there before the first bomb, so obviously they are innocent. And this is, it's a reasonable scenario to postulate. However, as I've come to understand a little bit more about some of the things behind this, I've come to see a different perspective on it. For instance, I mentioned in the last couple of videos about knowing the truth about Islam, the hijra, which is the colonization, taqiyya, the deliberate misleading impression, and abrogation, which is the replacement of the early compassionate teachings with the later warlike ones. Having factored that into it, as well as my concern about our own government's position with regard to this, as I've also mentioned recently, since I've come to understand the way that Sharia law and Islamic teaching works with those things I've mentioned, hijra, taqiyya, so on, then it's become, well, what I would have thought would be obvious to anyone if they study these things, that you understand that this is a genuine threat. And what concerns me is that, and I remember thinking this about economic crises in the past, that the civil service in Whitehall is full chock-a-block, or it should be, full of highly qualified people who have been to Oxford and studied, one would hope, history and politics and economics and these things at a very advanced level, so that if a government, wants to put in a certain policy, that they can then say, well, this has happened before and this is likely what's to happen. So I would hope that there were in Whitehall, in the Foreign Office, scholars who have studied other parts of the world, international politics and history, who know about the history of Islam, who have studied Islam as an academic discipline without accepting it as a religious belief. And these people, who should have been there since hundreds of years ago, since we had the British Empire engaging in foreign territories, one would imagine that in the 19th century these people, one may get into the whole imperial business of questioning that, but the point is, they knew how to do it then, if they were going to take advantage of things, or know how world politics and history has gone, who has particular cultures and how to respond to them. There was there was more classical understanding in those days, whereas now, since the Second World War, our culture's position has completely gone down the drain, and nobody seems to have any understanding of how politics and history and the development of civilizations evolves. So one is led to think, well, perhaps they do, and they're doing this deliberately, because if you have the opportunity to recruit the finest minds of the greatest universities in the English-speaking world, then why wouldn't you get people who can tell you, yes, Prime Minister, no, Prime Minister, you don't want to have too many Muslims in this country because this is what happens. It's a matter of historical fact. unfortunately, I think that Nick Kollerstrom was big on the technical detail and short on the sociological and historical understanding of Islam. Sadly, I think he may well have learnt more about it since. But having come to the conclusion whereby I think that our governments must know, they must know in some way what they are doing in allowing the mass ingress and the build-up of Islam in our cultures. Because they're parroting all these phrases. I mean, are they really, are they really such puppets that they don't question what any of this is about? I don't know. I hope not. I mean, Cameron might have been a bit selfish and a bit of a moron in some ways, but he's got a pretty good education behind him, and he was pretty good at memorising speeches. So I would have thought that he knew something about what was going on. So one has to assume, basically, that we have been sold down the river by these ruling classes, or the people who control them, because we're now being told by people like the French Prime Minister that we should get used to these terrorist attacks. And of course we're constantly being told that it's not Muslims, that it's just some kind of aberration. But I think it is. It is an exploitation by the string pullers behind the scenes who know the nature of Islam, and they want to inflict it upon us so that they can break down our society. And this doesn't mean that, I've come across quite a few people in kind of New Agey circles, and I'll have to talk about my connections to New Agey circles sometime soon. But they're saying desperately, no, well, we mustn't react to this. We mustn't, we've got to be, compassionate to these Muslims, when on their side, they've got their imams and their ideologies pushing them for this, as well as, of course, the globalists messing around with just creating more conflict wherever they possibly can. But I mean, there are things going on now which kind of mess with your cognitive dissonance. Just as we've seen, well, basically people say one thing, another thing happens. For instance, well, the example I was thinking of was the way that the father of the Orlando shooter was seen directly in line behind Hillary Clinton in the camera angle at a recent speech she gave. Now, there are two things about this, obviously, is how on earth did this guy get in there? Of course, it's all about tolerance and everything, but he claimed that he just applied for a ticket. He's just a member of the Democratic Party. He applied for a ticket, and that was where they put him. Well, the fact that he's directly in the line of sight from the camera behind Hillary Clinton, that is too much of a coincidence, and there's plenty of people saying that. So what's going on there is this cognitive dissonance thing I was saying. So you've got this guy who is associated one of the worst mass murderers in American history, right behind Clinton. Now that creates an association. Normally one would think, oh, guilt by association if it was an attempted subliminal, but then I think they're doing a lot of these things. It's the whole thing of like, you know, you get a Muslim to kill a whole bunch of people, and then he will say, no, it's not all Muslims. So you're having this cognitive dissonance between the actuality that you can see, the physical reality, the actuality, and the thought memes that are being thrown at you. Not all Muslims, not all Muslims, without looking beyond the superficial detail and understanding that it's an ideology which is setting itself off against us and within us. And so through this cognitive dissonance, you've got this kind of grinding of gear wheels, almost like people throwing gravel into a gearbox or something, because these two things, they obviously, we have had tremendous amount of, it's just like every day now, every day, some bombs, some, at least in Europe, and there's very, very parallel things going on between Europe, Britain and America. We're having this ground into us, and the cognitive dissonance between the obvious nature of what's being done to us, and at the same time the guilt tripping, the mind gaming is constantly being ramped up. And people are getting through this because political movement is you know, arising in response to this. I was thinking also about where this came in, because there seems to have been this infiltration. Obviously, in previous generations we didn't have this massive influx of immigrants, and particularly of Muslims, and particularly, unfortunately, the Labour Party is a very big part of this, because it's been long controlled at one level by Fabian socialists who wish to completely break down and remake the world. So obviously we know about Tony Blair and his plan to flood the nation with immigrants, so that the Conservative majority, with a small c, would be broken down. And I think he probably meant with a big C as well. That's certainly gone. So what we seem to be getting now to a point where terror is being normalised. So we can see that this involvement, this what is probably entrapment of wannabe jihadis, like we saw with the 7/7 bombings, because they always say, well, so and so was on the radar, this chap who did this bombing or that machete attack or that truck, that oh, he's known, or they'd kept track of him, or they lost track of him, or he's got a criminal record and he's been released. So we can see that we kind of got a situation whereby it's kind of half managed that these people are allowed to kind of wander around, but at the same time there aren't the resources to follow and manage them anyway. So that just continues to raise the normalisation level, whereby things happen daily now. The more they happen, the less they're reported, unless it's a really, really big one. And I do believe that this has been purposely allowed and somewhat encouraged by the people behind the scenes, and it wasn't. And I don't think it was just a Blairite plan. Let me see where I was. Yes. Well, yes. I think this is all. This is really. We've had this going for a long time, and it's not just about Islam or Christianity. We saw this in the 80s when what was known as the strategy of tension was carried out. With CIA and NATO bombings, like Bologna, the Gladio ones, whereby they would encourage and entrap communists, or in this case of Northern Ireland, it's known that the MI5 mould various IRA cells, and so they're always in there looking for the wannabes. They want to looking for a wannabe jihadi in Leeds, looking for a wannabe jihadi in a wannabe IRA bomber in whichever part of Belfast it would have been, and this all kind of goes to that big picture, whereby I think that this is something they must, that on the one hand there's that arm of it where I say the civil servants must know, the politicians, some of them have really got good educations behind them. These people must know what they're getting into with their tolerance of Islam, the religion of peace. They must know it's a complete load of lies. So on the other side, we have the globalist involvement in the intelligence services, which do a mixture of encourage, entrap, allow these agents of chaos to wreak havoc on our society and just fragment it more and more with their diversity. So, so I'll try and wrap this up now. Obviously, it's a big topic. The main thing is, what I'm trying to say is that 7/7 was both a false flag, but also a jihadi opportunity, because these guys, they were real jihadis, but at the same time, nothing like that would have happened if the security people hadn't set it up, because obviously the security people had to do this before. They had to plant the bomb underneath the train. So they are themselves trying to promote the Islamic threat. So those guys, they would, they should have just been picked out at an early stage, and we should never have seen any of this. But the point is that there is a fertile breeding ground for these people, and it's developed. It's developed since then, and yeah. So the elites, they are putting these. It's like Islam is like a scorpion hiding under a stone. You leave it in the Middle East, it'll lie there under the stone, and you just. But unfortunately, stupid people have gone and poked this, and they've deliberately invited the scorpions. and then they just mess around there. These people, Stefan Molyneux will go on at great length about how people in the Middle East and particularly Africa are of a lower intelligence than European peoples, and certainly they seem to have less impulse control because once coaxed out of their den, they have become quite a threat to us. And of course the thing is, they have this awful Islamic ideology of taking over the world. So we've just got insane people who want to use Islam as a means of first destroying our civilization and then replacing us with it, and they hope that they will have a sufficiently protected or privileged position that they won't be affected by it. But it's utterly insane. And of course the thing is that the Islamic imams and jihadis in the Middle East, they don't think about the fact that they're being prodded and exploited by the Soros and the Clinton and everybody. They see themselves as taking advantage of this situation, and they may well be. They could be the winner in this, because we have been betrayed to this enemy by our leaders like Clinton and Blair and Obama and Cameron, and well, we have to wait and see what may, but she's not got a very good track record with all her lovely remarks about Sharia, you know, say about how good it has been for some people in this country and stuff. And that's where I get my doubt of whether these people really know what's, well, they must know what's going on. That's where I doubt them, because it has to be plain to me, surely, that, well, I hope it is to you as well, that if Theresa May has not had somebody, some high-up educated civil servant saying, look, Mrs. May, you may not like to know this, but Islam is a very dangerous creature, and allowing it to increase its presence in our country is increasing that danger. And some of your predecessors have done silly things to both encourage and provoke it. But I think the one final thing I would like to say is that this is the rounding this back on the material from Nick Kollerstrom, is that I do think it is very important to disregard, I'll be kind to him because he's a nice chap, he's done lots of good work, but one has to disregard his conclusion about the 4 young would-be bombers. I don't think that they were people who were assisting the security services with an exercise. I think that they were wannabe jihadis who had been entrapped by the security services, and maybe the security services thought they could get more, but quite clearly they wanted to, a bit like some of the other things that Nick Kollerstrom has investigated, which I'll leave for another time. They obviously wanted to exploit the opportunity, stoke the fires, but these young men, I do not believe, were innocent. I believe they were wannabe jihadis, and had they had the opportunity, they would have done something awful. But the fact that they had been entrapped would not be something that the security services would want to be allowed to be known. So, you know, it's kind of like both sides are guilty in this. And I wish that Nick Kollerstrom had been kind of wiser to the nature of Islam, because he was, I think, suckered by the propaganda that the families and others put out. I was taken in by it myself. I believed for a couple of years that these poor young men were, really innocent and stuff. So it's just a nightmare of people exploiting other people, and given a chance, it's like molecules boiling off. I think, raise the pressure a little bit and a few molecules or atoms will boil off the surface of the demographic. And I think that's what we're seeing at the moment, and we have all these people to blame for it, getting us into this. Tony Blair and Clintons and Obama and the stupid people that they prod and promote and provoke with their mad Islam. So anyway, that's really it. It's being done to us, and we have to resist. They want us to give in to the terror. They want us to become accustomed to it, like Prime Minister Val says. We have to get used to it. What is it? He wants us to go into a form of depression known as learned helplessness. If you can't do anything, if you're constantly punished and you're unable to do anything about changing the situation, you become depressed, and that's what they want to put us into. They want to put us into all a state of learned depression, that we cannot do anything about it, and the cognitive dissonance would feed that, the confusion and the contradiction between these things that we see, that we know, so it is very, very important. All I can do at the moment is talk about it on the internet, but the more people talk about it, then the less politically incorrect it becomes, and other people find it easier to talk as well. So you have to break through the cognitive dissonance, point it out, and not give in to the submission. Find ways of working against this. Mostly talk to people about it. Break down those politically correct barriers. This is a huge topic, and it goes into everything. So just talk about it, break that cognitive dissonance. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you. Goodbye. Hello everybody, I'm Claire and welcome to my video blog. Now today I've got rather a complicated thing I want to talk about. It's about the 7/7 bombings. I'm sure everybody will be familiar with what I mean here. The bombings that took place in the London Tube on the 7th of July 2005. The official story was that 4 young men went to London, 3 of them from Leeds, and I believe they picked up one on the way, and they got to London and blew up these various some of his other more recent material, interesting though it might be. However, he's a very interesting chap who is an extremely well qualified forensic scientist, and he had some very highly positioned position as I think it was a tenure of some seat in the philosophy of science and forensic science. extremely well qualified chap. He looked at the data on the 7/7 bombings, and I've read his book, Terror on the Tube, and his data is absolutely vital to understand this. Although I disagree with some of his conclusions about the intelligence, they were supposed to have blown up the train. And I saw one of the pictures of the floor of one of these coaches that was supposed to have been bombed by the by the young chaps with their rucksacks full of chapati bombs. And one of the most obvious pictures was of the floor being blown up like that. And as Nick Colostrom pointed out, who is a forensic scientist, this is impossible for somebody who is holding a bomb on their back. If anything, the bomb would, the floor would be down like that. Although he says that he doubts whether the strength interpretation of the bomber's motives, and I'll come to that. But the first thing we need to know about the bombings, which claimed 52 people, and there do seem to have been some sort of bombing, and it might have been misreported or incorrectly reported or re-reported, but there were definitely some bombs went off on public transport and some people were killed. However, it was not quite as the media reported, because there are numerous contradictions and inconsistencies. Now, the bombers were supposed to have got on the train and with their improvised bombs, which in themselves were a joke apparently, but with their improvised bombs, trains and bus, I think there was. Now, there are quite a few problems with the official story, not least of which that quite a few details got changed in the process of the day, but I shan't be going into all those details, but trying to have an overview of what this was about, because there's been quite a lot of work done on this by the alternative community, and I'm going to be particularly talking about Nick Colostrom and his work on the book Terror on the Tube. Now, Nick is an extremely controversial chap, and I shan't be getting into